Hi there, my name is Sean McGeever, and I'm going to do Talk Tuesday, actually kind of wrapping them up here. This is one more chapter in Mark, and then I've gone through every gospel, so I'm just about done with this. 4 years of doing this. So anyway, I'm excited to talk about Mark 15 today and how you might use that in a club talk. One thing about this is if you're in Young Life, Wildlife, etc., you most likely have heard a quote-unquote crosstalk before. That's great, but I want to encourage you to put your memories and kind of ideas on hold, on pause, and to reread Mark 15 through with fresh eyes. I mean, I've heard plenty of crosstalks, I've given plenty of crosstalks, and still, I try to read it afresh, anew, to see what Mark had to say there. So anyway, do your best to let the text actually speak to you to give you your talk, rather than maybe what you might remember. You can come to that later. Some of your good memories and highlights from before, but let the passage speak to you. Another thing is, as you look at it, the content of the crosstalk covers a lot of verses. In this case, there's 47. And so it's really too many to read in the time that we normally have allotted for a club talk, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, maybe for wildlife, for a crosstalk. Maybe you can go a little bit longer in high school, 15, maybe 18 minutes, something like that. But really, you don't have time to read all the verses and to explain them all. So don't do that. Instead, become really familiar with the text. Be familiar with the outline, and then highlight a couple words or phrases that you want to read. Certainly don't just say all of it kind of from memory. What I like to do is kind of go through the parts that I'm kind of walking them through, summarizing, paraphrasing, and then I say, hey, and get this, I want to read this to you. And then I open it up and I just read a couple of the phrases. In fact, the ones that I would highlight in this, in Mark 15, even though I'd talk about the entire chapter, are some of the verses in like verse 33 through 39, really kind of in the key moments of Jesus' death. So anyway, I have a little bit of an outline of the passage. Really, there's 4 parts. The first part is Jesus's conversations with Pilate, the Roman governor. And there's the questions that Pilate has, and then there's this issue of Barabbas. It's part 1. The second part is Jesus's suffering or sentencing and suffering. This goes on for quite a while, about 14 verses. This is where he's whipped, crown of thorns, he's mocked, he's spit on, he's stripped, all of that. The third part is the one where I would probably highlight the most, which is Jesus' death. Actually, just hold on for a second, because the way Mark goes through it and how he highlights it might be different than what you've heard before. So anyway, but this is where we have the cry of abandonment, we have Jesus' death, the temple curtain is torn, and the centurion's response. And then the fourth part is the tomb, that Jesus is, after he's dead, he's laid in the tomb, in the cave, and the rock is rolled up. And that's going to segue perfectly into the talk the following week. Anyway, or you could even do it together if you want, but this is a crosstalk, so here we go. So there's those 4 parts. One thing that, and also if you want to just kind of have a big picture of all 4 Gospels, I have a link in the download sheet that you can get, on my website with a little sheet here, and you can see how all the Gospels kind of harmonize about the order of what happens to Jesus. Anyway, the thing I want to mention about Mark's account of the cross that it might be a little bit different than what you expect is just when you plainly read the account of the cross, Mark does not go into details about Jesus's kind of agony due to crucifixion. He doesn't emphasize the painful, torturous details of being crucified on the cross, like the nails and the hanging and all the breathing, all that. If you want to emphasize the torture of Jesus on the cross and how painful that is, it's easy. You can just hit play on the Passion of Christ. But here's the thing, Mark doesn't do that. And so if you're talking through Mark, or probably any of the gospel passages, I don't recommend that you do that either. Why? Because the gospels don't do that. It's not that it's not there, and it's not that it's not important, but it's not what they emphasize. And so I think we should take a lead from the gospel writers on that. Anyway, the emphasis isn't on him and the pain of the cross necessarily, or of getting whipped. It's not really on that. The emphasis of Mark in particular is on Barabbas. It's on how the crowd treats him. It's on Jesus' mockery. It's about the thieves on the crosses, the other crosses around him, and Jesus' last moments. So anyway, what Mark is getting at is the why behind what Jesus is going through, more so than the how. And so I encourage us to talk more about the why and the experience rather than maybe the how of the cross, which you can certainly mention, but I wouldn't push it as far as maybe what I've seen a lot of the crosstalks I've seen in my life too. Anyway, I have a couple other verses in here to kind of tie it together for the why. If you download the sheet, but they're probably familiar ones. Romans 3:23-24, Romans 5:8, Romans 6:23, John 3:16. Those are great verses to kind of complement and explain kind of in a nutshell what's going on there. That I was just talking to my kids, my own kids, and I asked them, hey, what would you want me to emphasize in telling people about a crosstalk? And they said, make sure that they know about this is on purpose, that this is in our place. The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. So the gift, and then another child of mine said, make sure that they know that Jesus' death is for them right now, who they are right now, sin and all, just as they are, Jesus died for them. Not about who they might become one day if they, become a Christian. And so, anyway, Romans 5:8 does that perfectly. She was summing up that for God chose His love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So, anyway, what are a couple main points? Well, there's plenty. Most notably, what is your response to Jesus' death on a cross for our sin? I like saying our sin, not your sin, because it's all of us. So, anyway, what is your response to this? Then another main point would be kind of dialing in on the difference between the response between Pilate and between the Roman centurion at the end. So you kind of have these at the beginning, at the end, kind of, book cover. So, in the beginning, you actually have Pilate 3 times say, calling Jesus the, quote, King of the Jews. And at the end, you have the Roman centurion saying, truly, this man was the Son of God. And so you see in the beginning, someone who's willing to acknowledge that maybe he has some prominent religious role as a Jewish leader or something, even though they deny that. But and instead, at the end, you have a Roman centurion who is saying, no, this is the Son of God. Not just of like maybe a religious sect that everyone knows about like God. And so maybe a main point would be many of us are like Pilate, maybe willing to say that Jesus was, maybe an important religious figure, King of the Jews, but we don't necessarily call Jesus the King of my life. So can we respond like the Roman centurion and say, truly, this man was the Son of God? What does this show us about Jesus? I could go on and on, but maybe just 2 points. Jesus suffered death, but also incredible pain, loneliness, heartbreak, and abandonment. I mean, it's as clear here as anywhere else in the Bible. And that second, this man Jesus was the Son of God, verbatim, verse 39. What does this have to do with our life? Well, what does this matter to me? And I think this is super important. I think young people, I don't know if I'm young anymore, but urgently don't really care or think a lot about our eternal destiny. But I think that we do care about our kind of our eternal suffering. We don't really think about eternal destiny, nothing in the future, but we do care a lot about our present suffering. Like life sucks right now. Life is difficult right now. Not always, there's highs and lows, but like everyone gets that, young, old, in between. And so, what does this do? What does this say to us? Jesus cares about our present suffering. And so I think that we can build upon that and say that, really our present suffering, if you kind of stop and think about it, is due to our own sins and the sins of others that have impacted us. And so Jesus' cross is connected to the pain and the suffering that you and I go through right now. So you could help connect that link if you needed to or wanted to go in that direction. And then another point, what does this have to do with our lives? That you are never alone in your difficult circumstances. You are not abandoned by God. Jesus joins you in your pain and suffering. Our present sufferings are foretaste, appetizers of kind of the sin that we have right now, but also what awaits us. And so where is Jesus right now? He's on a cross. He's with us suffering. He's at the right hand of the Father, but where is Jesus? When we're suffering, he's with us. He's suffering with us. We have that in the cross. Anyway, we're never alone in our difficult circumstances. Here's a couple technical details. I'll give you an analogy and then I'll wrap this up. There's a lot of technical things that you could choose to speak about. I wouldn't recommend highlighting all these, but as a speaker, as a leader, I would encourage you to know these. One, Pilate, he's the Roman governor of Judea, and he was the only one that had the authority to have someone killed, to have Jesus put to death. That's why the religious leaders bring them to Pilate. That's how he fits in. And it does sound like he's a pilot of an airplane. But that just happens to be his name. Then there's Barabbas, and this is another thing that you could build upon. But Barabbas was a Jewish rebel who committed murder, who deserved to die. He had committed murder in a plot to overthrow the Roman government. Totally guilty, and obviously he gets exchanged. A guilty man gets exchanged for an innocent man. I'll come back to that in a minute. Crucifixion. You probably know quite a bit about crucifixion. I won't go into all the details. But one thing that, as I was studying this, is I wasn't quite familiar. I'd read it. Actually, I had underlined an old book I had read. But crucifixion was really reserved for the people who were in the lowest class of society. This was the upper class had more quote-unquote humane executions, like beheading and things like this. Jesus died alongside, among, and with the overlooked and the poor. And I think that Jesus' self-identification and being among those who are at the bottom of society is important. With the scourging, which is a weird word. What does that mean? Well, that's the whipping with the cat o' nine tails. It doesn't really emphasize that. If you look at it in verse 15, it just mentions that happened. So Mark doesn't go into all the details about it. I don't think we should either. But basically, this is a punishment with a whip made of leather. The maximum punishment was 40 times. We know that from Deuteronomy 25, also in 2 Corinthians. And once again, this was actually something that reserved, if you're a Roman citizen, you weren't allowed to have this. So this was only kind of for foreigners and for aliens, quote unquote. And remember, Jesus went through that suffering with them. It says in verse 27, it talks about the people that he was crucified with. I think it's interesting that since there were three crosses, there's the two robbers. We know that those robbers were, being executed for being involved with some sort of rebellion. The word, kind of their history as you look into it. I agree with some commentators that say, actually, the reason that there was three crosses that day is one of them was actually reserved for Barabbas. I mean, literally, Jesus was on a cross meant for someone else. And that's why we have the two other robbers, that they were implicated in Barabbas's plot, and they were being crucified also. Literally, the person who was the kingpin of this plot, he got to go free, and Jesus went in his place, a cross that was reserved for someone else. I mean, cross that was reserved for me. I literally do not have to go through that punishment because of Jesus' death in my place. Another one, the cry of abandonment, verse 34. Why have you abandoned me? My God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, this is like beyond explanation. I can't explain it all. What's actually going on there. It's obviously a quote from Psalm 22, but if I could put it as simply as possible, I know I'm getting in the right direction with this, though it's not perfect. There's all sorts of challenges with this, what's happening here, but I think that in that moment when he says, why have you forsaken or why have you abandoned me? Jesus is mysteriously taking upon himself the separation from God that we deserve. Isaiah 59:2, you can read more about that. But because of our sin, we deserve a relational separation that Jesus experiences right in that verse. It's complicated. How could Jesus be separated from God if he is God? I don't think we need to go into that. In fact, it doesn't try to explain it. It just recognizes the pain of feeling like we're separated from God. And that is something that I think a lot of people, myself included, can identify with. The temple curtain is torn in two. This is, the temple was an incredibly important, if not the most important place on earth, and that this is in the Holy of Holies. There's a curtain in there that separated the Jewish people and even the priests and even the high priest from the most intimate, most present place of God on earth. And this is torn from top to bottom. And this is symbolic of the access that we all now have to God because of Jesus' death on a cross. And so there's that. The last one, and then I'll move on. I told you there's all these details. Do not highlight them all, but at the end, we have the centurion saying, truly, this man was the Son of God. And again, this is a Roman centurion, a Roman who declares, unlike Pilate, that this isn't just a Jewish leader, this is God. And in fact, this is the only place in Mark's gospel where someone who's like in their right mind and who also means it, believes that Jesus is God and says it out loud. Anyway, there's that. I want to give you 2 illustrations and then I'm done. One would be that you could have a temple curtain. You could like make a curtain of some sort and have it at the beginning. Just there, set it up maybe before club, and you walk up, and then when you get to the part where it says it was torn from top to bottom, you go and maybe you rip it open and you say, look, because of our sin, we had something that was a barrier between us and God, and that barrier is gone, just like that temple curtain was torn. And now we have access to God. Our sin does not preclude us from getting to know God. The question now is, do you want to know God? Because that barrier has been torn. That would be one option, and I've seen that in my club, and it's gone well. It's powerful. Another one is just simply to have a cross. I got a cross here, and there's a bunch of things you could do with a cross. I wrote down a whole bunch here. One, you could actually have the 2 pieces not connected, and have people write their names on them. I have some names on here. They might not know, why am I writing my name on a piece of wood? And then during the talk, you actually put them together to symbolize, what Jesus has done for them. Maybe read off their names. Here we got Bailey. Here we got Mackenzie. Up here we have Talia. All sorts of people. Call out their names. Read them one by one. Say, Jesus died for you. Aria, whoever it might be. I think just personalizing it, making sure that they know this is for them. It's not just something that happened 2,000 years ago. I think that could be great. So writing their names on it, putting it together in the midst of them. You could hammer nails in there. I've done that before. You could also give kids a sticky note and have them write their name on it and then come put it up there at the end of the talk, or a note like thank you or anything that they'd want to say to God and put it up there. You could have them write a short letter and put it up there. I've seen some people, like my friend Jorge, he actually got one of those Polaroid cameras, took lots of pictures of kids, had them up, stapled up on here, and as he was talking through his talk, you put them on there with, just kind of adding them, just trying to personalize it. So anyway, there are hopefully somewhere in there some helps for going through Club Talk, and I hope that it's great, and I hope that I gave you something to think about there. I know Maddie Farmer, love you out there. I know you're going to be doing it in our club on Monday, and I'm so happy that you're going to get to do that. So proud of you and praying for you, and looking forward to God doing his incredible work once again through us getting to proclaim what Jesus has accomplished on the cross. All right, talk to y'all later. Bye.